Thanks, everybody, for joining us. As we are meeting amidst the holiday season, having just finished Diwali and Hanukkah and are anticipating the solstice, Christmas, Kwanzaa, and the New Year, we are entering a time when many spiritual practices celebrate the light, even when we are in the midst of some of the darkest days, right? So in our journey tonight, the impact of spirituality and religion on Parkinson's, we hope to shed some light on some of the darker aspects that arise when living with Parkinson's, those existential questions, and how we can use the lens of spirituality and religion as a tool in living well with PD. The idea for this conversation came from my co-host, Dr. Alessandro Di Rocco. Alex, as he prefers everyone to call him, is a much-loved and respected neurology specialist in New York City. He's an expert in Parkinson's disease and other movement disorders, and is the director of movement disorders for Northwell Health, and serves as a professor of neurology at the Donald and Barbara Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra, Northwell. Alex is the reason this program exists. He lives across the street from our building on Amsterdam and 76th Street, and he got the idea for this program 13 years ago. It was a eureka moment. Maybe exercising might help people living with PD. And what better place to do that than at our thriving, caring Jewish Community Center. Alex, when we started to talk about what this year's PD Now event should look like, you were very drawn to this conversation about the influence of spirituality and religion when someone's faced with a chronic diagnosis. And as a medical doctor, you said that you often are asked existential questions. I'm curious about what those questions are and how often that happens to you.
Well, I can approach this question through different angles, but I think that the dialogue we had with the JCC and the building of the JCCs to sort of address this disease, which is complex and evolving from all aspects, not just the medical, not just the visit at the clinic and beyond. This time I'll start with the visit at the clinic. There are times when sitting on the other side, on the medical side, you really feel that no training, no medical school, no learning that you had or you can help you answer certain questions. And there are defining moments in the diagnosis of disorders like Parkinson and some other disorders. But we think in medicine a little bit like, like a mechanical issues, like, it's like a car making a little noise and, having a little trouble there. And the same, our body makes a little noise, a little pain, a little cranky signal there. And, go to the hospital, the doctors, the clinic, and, we fix it. Sometimes it's an easy fix, sometimes not. And this is a lot of what medicine is about, but certainly not in our field, not in our world. One of the moments, one of the defining moments, one of the most difficult moments, despite the all years I had in clinic serving the Parkinson community, is the moment in which you have to tell someone, I'm really sorry, but I believe you have Parkinson's disease. And it's not a diagnosis that can be fixed with anything. Can be lived through. And there is an encouraging element to this. But in many ways, yes, it is a medical diagnosis, but it's also an existential diagnosis. From this moment on, your life will be different. From this moment on, you have to rethink your dreams, your thoughts, the way you thought, your aging will be, or whatever dream you had, whatever is made our life, or you have to adjust, or it's no guarantee that this is going to go as planned. It goes way beyond the technical diagnosis and then the discussion on the medication and what to do. And this is often one of the most difficult moments. I know there are people with Parkinson on the panels, and they may share their experience. And of course, everybody reacts in a different way. And many times I sort of felt that I had to change clothing from, the white coat, even though before COVID, I never used to wear a white coat. Now I do, to some kind of different type of sort of presence. And oftentimes I felt like, I'm not really in my role, in my technical role. I'm sort of in an existential role about what's going to be life. What will happen to me? Why me is the other question often. What have I done to deserve this? And there is another moment that often transcends medicine and is a moment of end of life. And is a moment that, of course, not everybody with Parkinson will reach a point in which the disease will advance to that point, but it does reach that point, and sometimes, unfortunately, more often than we are able to contain. And then there is the other question, and is the question about end of life and how do I handle that? And is an end of life that comes much more gradually than, in other severe medical illness. Sometimes an end of life that announces itself a year or two before life actually ends. And this involves the care partners, the spouses, the caregivers. At that time, I feel sort of both, the inadequacy of just not having the instruments to sort of join hands, especially because a lot of time, I'm talking with people who maybe have a cultural, religious background different from mine. And I even lack the language, the lexicon to develop the dialogue or resonate in sympathetic way without really the ability to join in that way. And at that time, also, I feel that many times sort of a lot of people, a lot of patients bring back or evoke their religious belonging, their existential, their philosophical. And I always felt that that partnership, that dialogue is sort of missing in our handling. So I felt that this could be a way in which we can address this question. This dialogue could address these questions.
Wow. It makes me feel like what you're saying is there's both something universal and also individual about these questions so that we can approach someone who has this diagnosis and give them the support they need, either by knowing more about their religious faith or about religious faith and spirituality in general. And that sort of leads me to Rabbi Melinda Zalma, who is the manager of programs at the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. And this is an organization that Alex introduced me to. Melinda, thank you so much for joining us. She was previously served as the program director at the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York City. And in her work there, she brought together diverse people and organizations to build bridges and strengthen the community. For over 20 years, she has served as the chaplain in the U.S. Navy Reserve component. Melinda, welcome so much to the call. You've just heard Dr. Di Rocco describe what he says as a medical professional, that sort of struggle or pull of wanting to be there and wanting to comfort, and yet having someone of a different background or even the questions themselves being challenging as they're existential and they're not necessarily functional or medical in nature. Any thoughts from you around this particular issue?
Yes, definitely. And thanks for having me. One of the things that we do at Tanenbaum in our healthcare department is we provide tools and understanding for medical professionals to better understand the role that religion and spirituality play in their patients' decision-making and in their health. This is very important and so resonates with the work that we do because it's not a piece that doctors and nurses or healthcare professionals are trained on. And especially in this country where we often think that religion is separate from public life, when it actually isn't not, because if we're religious or spiritual people, it's going to be part of our life wherever we go. And especially when it comes to being vulnerable in a healthcare situation, and even more so when we're faced with a terminal diagnosis, because there are spiritual issues that come crashing in, not just about being able to draw on a religious tradition, but on spirituality in general. But first, I'll mention one of the resources that we put out and we work with hospitals is called the Medical Manual, Religio-Cultural Competence. And many in the healthcare professional have been taught and thought about cultural competence or cultural humility and understanding the culture that their patients come from and how that interacts with their healthcare and with how they treat them. And religion is a part and parcel of that. And so our medical manual originally went through 10 and now goes through 11, as we just added the Baha'i faith, major faiths. And one of the things we actually talk about is encourage healthcare professionals in consultation with the chaplains to do a spiritual assessment and spiritual questionnaire at different stages of patient care to find out what the patient draws on and where the spiritual connections are. And one of the things that I want to broaden up is if somebody doesn't have an identified religious connection, they might have a religious background for which they might not be so connected to or affiliated with at that moment, but that could also inform where they might draw sort of inner strength and inner spirituality in facing difficult decisions and a difficult diagnosis. But one of the things that's really been a big piece of my service in the military, especially now, is helping service personnel develop their inner spiritual resilience. And the military takes the attitude and the belief that spirituality is not just about religion or faith, but that it's about the connection to something higher and greater than oneself. And that applies to every single person because we all have an inner core and an inner being. We strengthen our overall fitness and resilience when we can strengthen our connection to something greater than ourselves. So that's another place where healthcare professionals and chaplains can connect with patients, no matter their religious background, to talk about what is it that gives them strength, inner strength, what gives them a connection with something greater than themselves, what inspires them, where do they turn to when they're feeling the lowest that can give them that greater connection and that greater inner spirit.
Beautiful. We pulled together a panel with your help of different religious leaders and lay leaders tonight, and I would like to introduce Reverend Christine Davies. She is ordained as a minister of Word and Sacrament with the Presbyterian Church, and she holds a Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary and a Master's of Social Work from Rutgers University. And we really are talking about the intersection of kind of social work and theology, and as you said, Melinda, resilience. Prior to your chaplaincy, Christine, I understand that you were a counselor for addiction and mental health, and certainly that there's an interface there for Parkinson's. We learned in our last Parkinson's, for Broadway Best for Parkinson's, the dopaminergic tendency for some of addiction. So there's definitely a link there too. And as a staff chaplain at the Methodist Hospital in Philadelphia, and all of your work as a social work, you're used to this interface, right, between a diagnosis, maybe even turning towards substances to placate that anxiety. And yet what we're talking about, or what Melinda so beautifully articulated, is where can we turn to within ourselves and also to something greater for strength.
Our hospital has community support groups for individuals with Parkinson, as well as caregivers for individuals with PD. And so I've done some work around emotional support and aspects of PD that come up in relationship to spirituality as well. And certainly the end of life piece that Alex was talking about.
Do you wish that people turned towards you or asked for this kind of consultation or care sooner, or do you find that it's highly individual?
I think it tends to be individual. Certainly, any sort of crisis can bring out coping mechanisms that people have relied upon in the past. And so, for some, that might be religion. But as Melinda talked about, there's certainly a difference between religion and spirituality. And really, at the onset of a lot of diagnoses, that question of why me comes up a lot. So we are consulted a lot at the beginning, at least in my hospital. It varies in various places, but to really help people as they're going through that existential meaning making.
Beautiful. Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation. I'm going to introduce our other lay leader here, Dr. Jyoti Lula. Jyoti is a retired Kaiser physician specializing in allergy and immunology and pediatric lung diseases. She has a clinical pastoral training and is certified Dharma ambassador by the Hindu American Foundation. Jyoti, welcome.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to give some of my feelings and comments on these issues of health and spirituality. Physicians, when you first train, you're just system and body oriented. You want to cure all diseases, and the diseases you can't cure, you just tell the patient, this is it. This is a chronic disease, and so far we have no cure. You've got to live with it. So I saw myself evolving. I've been in practice for 50 years. I'm not young. As I was getting older, I was counseling patients more beyond the body. Okay, this medicine will help your pneumonia, or this will help you this thing. I found that I was becoming their friend, holding their hands, because most of my patients, I'm allergy, immunology, the patients with chronic asthma, chronic COPD. Then the questions would come up, what will happen as I age and things. And then really coming back to Parkinson's, I had a person, my carpenter, who used to do a lot of things around my house, and he developed Parkinson's. So he couldn't work anymore. And that really hit me. Here's this man who can't earn his living. And then, of course, with aging, after 30 years of practice, 35 years, you start looking at what is there besides the physical elements of medical practice. I found myself talking more and more spirituality to my patients. And that's when I started taking some formal courses. I did my CPE, and I'm trying to get a credential, but I have no time for all those forms that I have to fill up. So every patient that I was seeing in my practice, I was holding their hand, talking about their journey in life beyond the physical elements. And this is where Hinduism, which is called Sanatan Dharma, comes into play. Because we think this life is not a permanent life. And you, the person you or I, is eternal. I never dies. So we have what we call Atma. Now, literally people translate it as a soul. But Atma is that you think of it as a battery or the power. That power goes from body to body to body. It is eternal, the Atma. So whatever you have in this body today with Parkinson's disease and all its limitations, when you die, you're going to leave that. And depending on what you have done on your present journey, in your present life, in terms of good deeds, bad deeds, etc., that's called karma. So depending on your karma in this life, you're writing the story for your next life. So besides the medical practice in Parkinson's disease, and all the latest treatments, we give patients a hope that this is not the end of you. The you that is there is eternal. So that's one thing about Hinduism, the Sanatana Dharma, is the message we want to give people. You know, because people just don't think, with death, I'm going to be gone. You're not going to be gone. It's your next life story you're writing now in this life.
Beautiful. And thank you so much. And to round out our panel tonight, I want to introduce you to Rabbi Simcha Weintraub. And he was the rabbinic director of the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services, where for 25 years he led the Jewish Healing Center. He has lived with type 1 diabetes for 40 years and Parkinson's for at least 8 years. So he is in a unique position to talk about spirituality, religion, and the intersection that we've been hearing all our lay leaders talk about tonight, and Alex as well, our thoughts on both religion and spirituality. Welcome, Simcha. Any thoughts right off the top that you have from listening to our speakers so far? I mean, does this strike a chord? Does this feel like, yes, these are questions that not only I have wrestled with, but people that I know who are living with Parkinson's wrestle with as well?
Very much so. I think that the idea that the person is bigger than their body, the sum total of the person needs to be addressed, and not everyone can do everything, but we can bring together a team to work with.
And that's exactly what we've done tonight. And if I could have all our panelists join us, our conversation tonight is really about the role of religion and spirituality can play in living with Parkinson's. And I'd like to talk with you all for a moment about your how you do exactly that. Take this, why me? Is life worth living now that I have this diagnosis? How can I go on, knowing this impact? Is it meaningful? I think, Jyoti, you've sort of addressed it already, but I wonder if, Christine, you can take that first. How do you help counsel people when they are because it's kind of a dark place, and it also feels to me like it's a place where acceptance, the balm of acceptance, hasn't quite yet taken root, and therefore it's almost circular in nature. That why me? What does it all matter? Does it make any difference? All those questions feel very circuitous and almost like a trap. Can you address that for us?
Yes, I would say why me is the number one question that is asked by patients in the hospital across diagnoses. And there's been research that's come out around it that says sometimes it's not even about the answer, although we would like answers about everything that goes on in our lives, or at least I would. But it's really can also be seen as an expression of suffering, really kind of a form of lament, to be able to say to one's God or divine or the universe just how upset they are about this particular thing. As mentioned earlier, this is a new diagnosis, a chronic diagnosis like this can bring about intrapsychic grief, right? This is not how you may have imagined your life to be going. And so to articulate that and to have a sacred space where you can do that, be it with a chaplain, be it with a physician, be it with, friends and family. I think that's the first step, is allowing for those conversations to happen so that people can be authentic about what they're feeling and experiencing. And sometimes it does lead to anger at God or the universe, or however one might define, something greater than themselves. But that's probably the number one emotion that I tend to see a lot of. And sometimes people have difficulty, particularly if they are steeped in a religious tradition, about vocalizing or articulating that anger. and might think that it is blasphemous to do so. So that's sometimes why I get it as a chaplain as opposed to their clergy person if they belong to a house of worship, because I'm a little more anonymous, and they feel like they can voice that to me. But really working through that, I encourage people as they sit with this to think, and it's going to be different for everyone, is how have you made meaning of other things that have happened in your life? Because it's going to be so personal and specific to one's own embedded theology or spirituality. But if they can look at it over time, and they may not have the answer that they're looking for anytime soon, but maybe a year, 2 years from now, things look a little bit different. But when they're in the crisis of the new diagnosis, that can be especially jarring.
Alex, I wonder if you could pop on and comment about the vulnerability of those first, 2 or 3 months when somebody has been diagnosed, and exactly what Christine was talking about, the anger, the emotion, the tumultuousness, and how that's a vulnerable time. And as medical professionals, it's a time when you're actually kind of on alert to your patients.
Well, yeah, I think certainly this is the most difficult time, and no matter how one can be prepared to this, the moment of reality, the moment in which this is sort of announced and then defined is a traumatic moment. People have followed for years who remember the exact date and time when I uttered the diagnosis. I'll say, you in, I don't know, 2013 at 3:15 p.m. told me that. And I'll never forget that moment. It's a moment of as mentioned before, and has been very eloquently discussed, as a moment in which there's a whole reflection on life. From a medical point of view, there is sometimes a moment in which we, of course, worry about how this is handled emotionally. Many times there is a support system, that is the family, the spouses, the community, religious or otherwise. And other times there is none. There is loneliness. There is nobody who's gonna help the person. This is a time when expression and sometimes acts of self-harm or suicide. This is something that probably occurs more in this very early moment than later on. Later on, there is a time in which, as we discussed, you sort of eventually make peace with the disease, and you learn to live with, or many people, not learn to live with this unwelcome guest that has entered your life. But that's a critical moment.
Melinda, I wondered if you could comment on that, as even in the military, right? That as a chaplain, that there are also those times when someone comes back, whether they've been wounded or they're about to go into battle, or and this is not what they expected, and that time being very vulnerable, and also that anger being very normal, and part of the whole process to accept that and let that actually fuel their actions. But how can we feel that and heal from that and not turn it inward, as Alex was saying, either from loneliness or implode?
I think the biggest piece is to acknowledge that it's part of being human and they're not alone in their reaction. I think that's the hardest piece, that I'm not allowed to have these emotions, or it's wrong to have these emotions, or it shows that I don't, I'm not grateful for my life. Or in the military specifically, it's, it could be I'm not strong enough, or that, that this doesn't happen to anybody else. So I think the first and most important piece is to let people know that all their emotions are okay, and part of the process, and that they're not the first nor the last, and they're not alone.
Yeah. And Jyoti, did you have any thoughts about that moment of why me, and sort of being angry at the creator?
This reminds me about the story about Buddha. So a person goes to Buddha and says, my son has passed away. He was a precious child. He was the first and only child of hers. And she was really overwrought with anger, fear, despair. So Buddha told her a very simple thing. He said, I want you to go to 10 homes down the street and find out if nobody has had any illness or death in their family. So as she was going, she found that there was no such thing. Every family had experienced some kind of a suffering, either from death, illness, and some incapacity. And she comes back realizing that this is life. It's a passage of life. Yes. So the question then comes up, then why this disease? Then we have this theory of karma. Karma theory is something that you did in your past life and you're paying the price now. So the moral of the story is do a good karma in this life so that you have a better next life.
Simcha, you're somebody who actually has gone through this process. You're also somebody who has counseled people through this process. How was it for you? Do you mind sharing with us?
I was fortunate in that I self-diagnosed. I had a tremor in my right leg that wouldn't go away. And every 6 months I went to a leading neurologist who said, I don't think this is Parkinson's. And I knew that my father and my aunt had Parkinson's, and I just knew it was my turn. So when another neurologist said, I think this is Parkinson's, I was relieved. I was happy. I had a name for it, and I could have a path. But I did want to say that when the why me question, I think can mean something different on Monday than on Tuesday. Behind it can be fear, can be rage, can be disappointment, confusion or despair. It can have different weights behind it. And so I try and find out where the person is at the moment that we're speaking. And I will say that if I had a goal, it would be to help move from why to how. In other words, how am I going to live now? How am I going to enjoy life now? How am I going to do things that bring me pleasure and bring others help? So I would say that rather than acceptance, I usually think about the word integration. Who wants to accept this? Not me, but I have to integrate it. I have to work it into my life plan and my self-portrait. So those are the things that come to mind. It really is the $64,000 question, which the Jewish tradition puts as Rasha v'tovlo tzadik v'ralo. An evil man has it good, and a righteous person has suffering or has it bad. And why? So we don't have an answer to that. There's a difference between an answer and a response. So you can respond to somebody without answering an impossible question.
Beautiful. Melinda, can you comment about that? Because it seems to be like what Simcha's telling us or talking about is really about resilience, right? That I have a choice. I can choose how I'm responding.
Simcha, I love the way you frame that as integration. That really, I'm writing that down mentally, because I think that's so important, because you can't ever get over whatever the trauma is. I mean, especially in something like Parkinson's, it's not going away. But I think also with every sort of hurt, it never disappears. It's how we integrate it into our being without negating the negative and the weight and the hurt, how do we find the blessing? And it's not to say, I don't want it's not to be trite to say, ignore the hurt, find the blessing, but even in the hurt and in the pain and in the tragedies, there can be blessings, and how do we find them and then integrate them into our lives and help us, yes, to get stronger, to be more resilient, and to connect with others.
And Christine, I see you nodding your head. Are you resonating with that as well?
Oh, yeah, I think that's wonderful. And certainly that balance, right, of the hurt and the blessings, because I think what happens and when spiritual harm can be done is when others in your life maybe have their own answer to the question, or they want to tell you all the blessings, or we sometimes use the term like silver line it, like they want to silver line everything for you and wrap it up with a bow. And that may not be resonating with where you are. And I've seen a lot of spiritual hurt done that way. And really what we're wanting folks to focus on is finding those blessings for themselves. So I can claim my blessings. I'm not putting the meaning that I've made of your situation on you. So just differentiating between those two.
And Jyoti, I wonder if you could talk about finding the blessing for oneself, that sort of both individual and sort of universal journey. Any thoughts on that?
I think you have to find where that person is in that spiritual journey. First of all, do they believe in that at all? And then try to build up, depending on where they are and what their beliefs are. There's a famous statement that says, just give your power of attorney to the Lord and just sit back and accept it. That's one extreme. The other extreme is the usual passage is find out where that person is in his spiritual beliefs, in his feelings, and try to build up on that from his past experiences and the past spiritual, and then also connect him with something that he values and thinks about besides his own illness. So I think those are the various choices that you offer depending on where the person is in his progress.
I remember, I'd love to shift the conversation into the end of life conversation and this idea that Alex was talking about, where he said sometimes patients ask me these questions, or I serve not just as a medical director, but I feel like a spiritual advisor. And that's, what is going to happen to my soul? And I want to talk about that a little bit because it is an existential question. And I wonder, Simpa, if we could start with you, if you've pondered that.
Yeah, oh yeah. There's one of the prayers we say when we wake up in the morning. Thanks God for giving us the soul that's pure. We start out the day with the soul that's pure and like a new slate. I spent a lot of time talking to people about what the image of God means. What does that strange phrase mean? And certainly it must mean that there's a part of us that's not quantifiable. In one support group that I led for chronic illness, one woman said one day, you know what I like about this group? Our bodies are distinct, but our spirits overlap. And I think that's I think part of what I'm saying is that the spiritual life is very broad and very eternal and very hopeful. It isn't. I will say that in the Jewish tradition, at the end of time, things are good. The end of the story is good. So, life is a bowl of cherries, but not all of them have been pitted.
I love it. Christine, did you want to comment on this sort of end of life question, soul question that comes like, what's going to happen? Do I have a soul? Is there a soul?
Yeah. Well, I'll come to it maybe from a different angle, from more of a practical angle, particularly being in the ICU and being a chaplain in the midst of COVID. We have a lot of families that are asking what is going to happen at the end. And so I won't get too much into the soul because that will vary so much with various faith traditions. But what I would encourage is anyone listening to have those conversations about what you would want for the end of your life sooner rather than later. In my hospital, we're in charge, the chaplains are in charge of doing the advance directives. And I'm a bit like Oprah when I go to a holiday party to my family. I'm like, you have an advance directive, you have an advance directive, just because I see how important that is for the family, for the caregivers. That is a gift that you can give them, because I've sat with countless families that are having to make decisions in the ICU and not knowing what their loved ones would have wanted. So having those conversations sooner, while it's not a pressing issue, I think is really a gift that you can give in terms of practically how that's going to happen for you. One, naming a healthcare proxy. So naming someone that is going to make medical decisions for you. So it's different than a financial power of attorney. Medical decisions for you in the case that you cannot make those decisions for yourself. And then the second part of that is instructives for living will. So what would I want? Would I want to be on a ventilator? Would I want to receive tube feeding? There's also a really great document that I would point people to called 5 Wishes. It's not in every state available, but in most it is. And that also gives you boxes to check off, what would I want if I am lying in an intensive care unit? My favorite is I'd like someone to massage my hands with warm lotion. So it's also giving you a little bit of empowerment about what you want your loved ones to know.
I've also heard of something referred to as an ethical will, which is, I wonder if, Melinda, is that something you're nodding? You want to know? Oh, Simcha, can you, or Jyoti?
Yeah, sure. We have collections of ethical wills from more than 1,000 years ago. They're often in the form of a letter to subsequent generations, bequeathing experiences and values and principles that have been learned in your own life or that you want to pass on. And there's some very beautiful ones. Maimonides, for example, is one that survives from him, at least one from him. And sometimes these are very long and incredible documents. And I will mention that both of my parents left handwritten ethical wills, which we discovered after their death. And my father's is particularly moving because he was a rabbi from Poland, and he a very traditional background, and he quotes the prayers, and he quotes the Talmud and the Torah, and he also mentions where the bank accounts are, and where so it's a very precious document, and families sometimes keep them for generations. They so they can learn from. And I did want to say something about learning from ancestors. A very important Jewish idea is that in facing our suffering, we should turn to the stories of those who went before us and how they managed their suffering. And I include not just family, but Eleanor Roosevelt or and any number of people who we can learn from. So I just want to say that the ethical wills are a very important complement to the legal documents that Christine was explaining.
And Jyoti, I wonder if this idea of learning from our ancestors, if that is in alignment with your faith as well.
Unfortunately, in India, the learning from ancestors sometimes is not well known to the next generation. So that's part because it's mainly by word of mouth and it gets lost. Things are not written down. So this is one of the reasons I'm involved with this organization, Sukham. is to make people, even just yesterday I was at a party, we were celebrating the birthday of one of our friends who's turned 98. So all the people were around him, and I was asking them how many of them because I knew the stock was coming up. And more than 50% of them, even though they are in their 70s and 80s, have not written down their advanced healthcare directives. So that's the reason we started this organization, Sukham, in the Bay Area, to create that awareness in these educated, high-tech people to think about the end-of-life issues.
Yeah, Christine, it sounds like, Jyoti experienced what you're talking about, right? The challenge of that. Anything that you, Dr. Di Rocco, would you like to just pop back on? Is there anything you want to add to the conversation or any questions you might want to ask of our amazing lay leaders? We so appreciate you being here tonight.
The comment I can make, and paraphrasing, the answer from the response, which was one of the lessons I received, and I was reflecting now many times. I am sort of facing that dilemma of an answer versus a response, and I thank you for that insight. As I thank everybody for the great insight. I hope that this dialogue can continue and we can sort of build from this incredible insight. We're working together. We're working on a similar journey. Accompanying people's life the best we can with insufficient knowledge of sort of medicine, certainly about Parkinson. And probably I realize with the world of wisdom that is there, belonging to different traditions, that could be such an enormous resource for people as they travel through this existential transformation defined by the disease. But I really hope that we'll figure out ways in which we can work together in this journey.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I want to now have Dr. Di Rocco stay on and Pat Bellman to come on and Simca to stay on. And we're just going to have a quick conversation around what it's like to be living with Parkinson's and to actually face some of these questions with your families. Pat is a proud native of Madison, Wisconsin, a dancer, a citizen of the world, having also lived in London, Melbourne, Hong Kong, and New York. She talked to me briefly about her own spirituality and was willing to come on tonight and talk to us all about how it is that her spirituality assists her in living with her diagnosis. She's been living with Parkinson's for about 6 years. Pat, thank you for coming on the call and for joining me and Dr. Di Rocco, joining Alex and Simca to kind of discuss, this conversation and how it's relevant for people living with PD right now, the people that you know and yourselves as well.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I feel very honored to be on this panel. And I've learned so much from everybody. And one of the things that I find really helpful in terms of spirituality is that everybody has a different way of looking at life and the end of life. There's no one answer. You just have to find the right path for yourself. And I was very fortunate when I grew up. I had wonderful parents who taught me the golden rule, which is basically do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself. And I've lived with that as my guiding principle and North Star then and now. And I think with Parkinson's, it's given me more of a focus for that. But the journey continues just day by day, and you just learn every day from life and people around you.
Thank you so much, Pat. Alex, can you talk more about how being a medical doctor with people living with Parkinson's really is accompanying them on a journey that's lifelong? And it starts with the diagnosis, and it goes on through the end of life. And as Jyoti was talking about, she says, I found that was becoming friends with my patients. I found that I knew them, I knew their families, and how that affects perhaps your own spirituality and questions, and as well as those of your patients.
Well, this is a very interesting question and the reflection. And yes, of course, there is a self-reflection. Sometimes I feel very privileged. Often, actually, it is an enormous privilege to be trusted in drawing people's lives for years and years. It's a privilege that allow me to reflect in many ways. I mean, I think it's we have been sort of discussing this over time. Even this very session is about really maybe a psychotherapy session for the sport neurology who doesn't know how to handle or he feels sometimes overwhelmed by that dimension, by that existential dimension. And as a physician, as a professional in any field, our tools are the tools we are taught. The tools that we acquire, and then there is sort of a self-learning that continues along the years. And this self-learning is only in part has been a self-learning of medicine, of discovery, of novelty in medicine and science and so on. But certainly has been a self-discovery, especially as my own evolution, my own growth from being a young and enthusiastic neurologist who felt that, of course, I'm going to cure this. What's the big deal? We'll find the cure, and 10 years from now, I'll find a different job because this is cured, which is probably what I felt when we started this. To sort of a process of maturity and a very humble process. I can tell you there've been enormous learning of acceptance, of joy, of fun, and some very tough moments in which I really felt I failed to understand the person, I failed to understand the emotion, I failed to understand the despair, the loneliness, the challenge. And so I don't know if I answer your question, but
no, you did. I think what you're talking about is that sometimes we think we're all heads, but we really are hearts too. And there's this growth. Simca, isn't there there's the quotes that the longest journey is from the head to the heart, right? I think I've heard that before, but this idea of integration, as you were talking about, it's not just the science and the function of the body and the medical, it's also the integration of the heart. And when we live and work and accompany people through their life with a diagnosis, we can't help but be affected by that whole experience in its totality. You said, Dr. Di Rocco, and I want to know what Pat and Simca think about this idea of when someone does accept that I have a diagnosis of Parkinson's, then they can begin to fight it. And you shared this quote with us by Isaac Rabin. Do you want to share that quote and tell us what you meant by that as we close out our evening tonight?
Quote is that you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. And the journey and that starts in the moment of a diagnosis is really a journey of making peace and developing an understanding and acceptance of this unwelcome. There's not a person who would obviously welcome that transformation in their life. But there is a point in which, we accept and make peace. I have seen and witnessed and admired ways in which people have taken this life transformation into, I'm talking about a word we use many times, into an existential growth. people who have developed, redefined their life, or maybe with a sense of, okay, well, I maybe, working on the job I'm working is great, but that's not, now that I have a different sort of a sense of self, maybe I ought to do something different in my life. And I've seen that done in many ways, and sometimes in very beautiful and inspiring ways. Obviously, other times it hasn't been easy. Other times people do feel overwhelmed. And in that, again, I think emphasizing another element of the religion, and we emphasize the element of spirituality and existential definition, support, identity, tradition. There's another element, which is the element of community. And I think that's really extremely important. I think if I learned something about this is that, which is, again, it sounds so obvious, but this is not a journey you can easily do alone. And if life has taken you to be not having a family, or it is so much more important to have a community. And sometimes communities are much more loving than families. We all know that. And I think, our communities at JCC is an example of that. And people who have the strength of their communities really take the journey in a very different way.
Beautiful. Pat and Simcha, you are both people that I feel have taken this diagnosis and done exactly what Alex is talking about, which is, okay, and moved with it. And can you talk about that a little bit? Have you accepted your diagnosis? Is that the right word? Or as Simcha, you said, integrated? And what is your relationship with PD now? And are you guided by your connection to your spirituality? Pat, do you want to go first?
Sure. And I think what Alex said was so profound, in that one of the most important things in the journey of Parkinson's is the acceptance of your diagnosis. Because once you have accepted that, and you have accepted that it's part of you, there's nothing to be ashamed of. It's part of the piece of the puzzle that makes yourself whole. Once you've accepted that, you have a sigh of relief, and then you can go forward and engage with others and other things that are larger than yourself. And you mentioned community, and I have found that I've been inspired by so many people that I've met within the Parkinson's community. That's been just so gratifying, and the spirituality of the community and the sense of inner peace and strength that you get from others is it's humbling, and it's just uplifting. Very special.
Yes, and thank you, Pat. And Simcha, humbling. Can you talk about humility and also where you are in your diagnosis and integration, and how your spirituality has helped you in this process?
Yes, I would say that that Parkinson's and me have made a ceasefire, and we haven't made peace quite yet, but we're ceasefire. So I don't fight it, and it doesn't fight me. It lays new challenges on that I have to face. But I'm fortunate that they're not all coming down all at once. They're incremental. I'll just cite one source really quickly. Maimonides, who was a 12th century Jewish scholar and physician to the caliph and a Jewish legal expert, in one of his writings, he's describing why you say certain blessings, and he says that when you see somebody with what appears to be altered limbs, or a physical difference, then you bless God for creating people differently from each other, for variegating, let's say, the human beings. And that to me said that incapacity is not inferiority, and that we have to see what people need. Here in Philadelphia, where I live now, seniors ride for free on public transportation. That's for that. Imagine, and the bus lowers so you can get on it. So I'm just thinking that I'm fortunate, and also I've uncovered so many sources that give me hope and guidance, and kind of also a form of the accompanying that Alex was talking about. You can be accompanied by live human beings, and you're blessed when you are. And the JCC is just remarkable in its Parkinson's community. But you can also be accompanied by ancestors and by texts from the past, and by the wise sayings and poetry and music and psalms, and on and on. We've talked a lot at the JCC about finding the gratitude, or naming the things that are going right. The pancake that you had that morning, or whatever it is the hundreds of miracles that are all around us, is a real spirit strengthener.
Yeah. And I think it goes right to our, we're going to finalize our chat and our conversation, but it goes right to the question in the chat. What if one doesn't have a spiritual practice, or the faith I am raised in, the way of looking at it doesn't resonate with me now? Then what? And I wonder if one of our lay leaders wants to pop on and answer that question, if you happen to be there. What if, Melinda, I was thinking of you, what if you don't have a spiritual practice? Do you encounter that as the Navy chaplain?
Yes, both as a Navy chaplain and in our work with at Tanenbaum, what we talk about is that spirituality doesn't necessarily have to be connected to religion. And certainly within the military, as a chaplain, you counsel people of faith, but sometimes there are people who they turn to the chaplain because of the 100% confidentiality, of the ease of access, and they don't have a particular spiritual practice or faith tradition. But what's important is that we all have connections to others and to the world around us, and that you might not call it a spiritual practice, but there are people who feel down, and if they go take a walk and out by the water and they feel uplifted, that could be a spiritual practice. It's really thinking about what is it that lifts you up when you're feeling down. That's the place to start. And perhaps it's the time to create a spiritual practice out of some of those things. And that's really where I would begin.
Really great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. This has just been amazing. Pat, Simca, any final words? Dr. Di Rocco, final words before we move on?
Well, the final words, I think, echo some of the comments were said, and my final word is an aspirational word. I actually hope that soon we actually can come together in person, and that dimension of community in which we actually are in the same room and under the same roof. While it's great to have actually some guests joining us from Pennsylvania or California, I miss our community elements. And I want to thank you, Caroline, and Whitney, for making this happen, making this discussions. Many times, sort of a little offense discussion, and you have really the ability to transform these comments and these discussions into larger question and to programs. that address really enormous, big questions in people's lives. So thank you for all the work you're doing.
Thank you so much. We are going to finish our program with a special treat and round out our conversation tonight. Alex and I both believe in the power of music. Simcha, you were alluding to that too. And I'd like to introduce you to a really special friend that I met just recently, and she was on our Broadway Best for PD in November, and she's back. We asked her to come and sing again for us. She's a Broadway actress whose career has spanned national tours and $1 Million Quartet and numerous regional theater productions across the country. And she was most recently Hodel in the critically acclaimed production A Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish. And that was fantastic. It was directed by Joel Grey off Broadway at Stage 42. And this role is perhaps, I think, your favorite, right, Stephanie? Because it was where she, yes, it was where she met her now fiance. So mazel tov to that. I found out she's getting married on April 10th, 2022. So that's really exciting. And Stephanie's uncle, and remind me of his name.
Tom Cragen.
Tom Cragen. Stephanie's uncle, Tom Cragen, lived with Parkinson's. So this topic is very meaningful to her, and she has agreed to come on and spend time with us and sing for us. Stephanie, anything you wanted to comment about tonight's show? I know you've often said to me, I wish that my uncle had this when he was here.
Yes, I do. And first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for having me and how honored I am to be here. I do wish that he would have had such an open and vulnerable and generous space where he would have been able to talk about such things. I know that, especially talking about the end of life conversation, I know it was difficult on him, but it was also very difficult on my aunt. So just to be a part of this is just truly such an honor and a privilege. And just thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. I understand that you have prepared, appropriately so, one of the most beautiful songs, Never Walk Alone, from Carousel, to capture tonight's theme. Stephanie, the floor is yours. Take it away.
When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high, and don't be afraid of the dark. At the end of the storm is a golden sky, and the sweet silver song of a lark. Walk on through the wind, walk on through the rain, though your dreams be tossed and blown. Walk on, with hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone. You'll never walk
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here. And I truly am so honored to be here. And I love listening in on these conversations, these so important conversations that you're having.
Oh, well, thank you for being part of the show. And we have another dear friend and colleague, Pam Quinn, who said that we also want to make sure that we find ways for people living with Parkinson's to also give back. We're also on the receiving end of help, but there is really an opportunity to find meaning and spirituality and connection when we give back as well. And I think that's an important comment. We hope tonight has shed a light for you and will help you or your loved ones navigate your life with Parkinson's and how to live and thrive with PD. We're going to bring out all our speakers and guests that are still here with us to wave and say goodbye. Good night, everyone. Be safe, be well, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.